Hi everyone, today I want to talk about gem choices, in particular for your armor sockets. So there are a bunch of different things that you can socket in there for various small effects, and a lot of people always ask me what should I use and why. If you have been following some of my builds, then you might have noticed I always ran with a lot of topazes for the damage reduction while crowd controlled, but there's also rubies just give you straight up life, or for example fortified builds can use sapphires for damage reduction while fortified. And then there's these other four here that I feel are all just like too niche or too useless. So there's healing received, which usually doesn't matter much because you can heal up easily with potions, for example, or other things. Then there's thorns. Well, I'm not really a big thorns fan, so this is only for very niche builds. There's barrier generation, which has the main problem is that barriers just cap out at 100% of your maximum life. So you can't go beyond that. And also this doesn't even work with a lot of specific barrier effects. So that's a bit of a problem there. And then there's amethysts that have damage over time reduction, which, yeah, is not really that dangerous, at least in PvE. In PvP, with like lots of poison rogues running around and stuff, I could imagine this to be somewhat useful, but outside of that, not really, I think. So that leaves us with the topazes versus ruby discussion and also the sapphires that I want to go into in this video. So you see me here that this is full topaz setup here on my eternal rogue. So this is something pre-season 1 that I leveled. And I always really liked the topazes because there was a lot of crowd controls in the game. So there were like the snakes that stun you. There is, you know, various elite affixes that can freeze you, fear you, whatever. It even works when you get slowed or when you get immobilized by spider webs, actually. So you can actually just stand in a spider web and be absolutely immortal when you have those topazes. Now, the thing is that a lot of those crowd control effects have actually been tuned down recently. So monsters just don't really use their crowd controls as much anymore. At least I can definitely notice that. This was not really in the patch notes, but this is something that the devs have discussed on various campfire chats. It definitely seems like monsters are just doing less, honestly. So at least that's my impression after playing, you know, like all day, every day, basically. And on top of that, we had some changes, like, for example, cold enchantment was removed, which was also another really big reason to include something like topazes in your gear. So actually what I have done earlier today, and which is also the reason why I make this video, is I have changed all of my setups that previously ran topazes into rubies. I was already running rubies on some builds, for example in Uber that makes the most sense, there's no crowd controls. Even in P100 9 dungeon pushing, usually it's a lot more slow paced, a lot smaller fights where it's easier to dodge certain crowd controls. So I was already running rubies there in my setups, but now I just went ahead and just put a straight up rubies into all of those setups because crowd controls for monsters are just not really a thing anymore for the most part. I know that a lot of people were still complaining that, yeah, we get crowd controlled all the time, but it definitely seems like it's massively toned down, and people might just be remembering their like launch experience where crowd controls indeed were a much bigger problem. So at least my baseline recommendation is that I would probably just go with rubies, at least for rogues and for like most typical builds from now on anyway. I also did this on my Sorc, for example. I'm going to do this probably on my Necro, and even on my Barb I actually removed sapphires. And there's another reason for that, which is that I actually just recently learned that the percent maximum life bonuses are actually multiplicative and not additive. So I was under the firm impression that these would all just stack up additively. So you have like 5 rubies, that gives you plus 20% life. But actually what happens is that you get 4% and then 4% again. So you multiply them, that instead of, for example, 20% bonus with 5 rubies, you get 21.7%. So you see here, this is 21 and then rounded to 0.7. So that is the actual life bonus. And this same logic applies to paragon nodes. So every class has these life nodes here, for example, in the starting board. And then you have like some other life nodes spread out over the tree. And they work exactly the same way. They take your base life, which is 7,959, which is when you have a naked character at level 100 with no stats. And then it goes times 1.04, etc. And this means that the more of those percent life bonuses you add, the more like flat life do you gain per ruby added or per paragon node added. So it becomes stronger and stronger, basically, in terms of total life gained. So this goes exactly the opposite way of basically everything else you have on your paragon tree, where you have lots of like these additive damage nodes, like here plus 5% damage, or you have like plus 5% physical damage, or you have like plus 5% close damage. You know, all this stuff is like the same additive damage category, where if you stack more of the same, it just becomes worth less and less comparatively to before. But this is exactly the opposite on life nodes. So life nodes actually remain really powerful and actually get better the more you stack of them. And exactly the same applies to rubies, where you can get this extra maximum life bonus. Now there's one important thing here, which is that this percent life bonus does actually not interact with flat life bonuses. So most builds probably have life on their helm like this here, or maybe you're gonna have it on like a ring or something like that, like here. And those flat values are just added at the end and are not increased by anything. So this means that if you actually have a setup where you have a lot of percent maximum life bonuses from the rubies, from the paragons, etc., and you're running around with like 13, 14, 15k life, then yeah, adding like plus 800 or something is actually not such a big deal. But on the other hand, if you don't have that and you actually don't run rubies, your life pool might be like 10,000, 9,000 or something like that. And then adding one of those items is actually much more powerful. But the bottom line is that when you have 5 rubies in your setup and maybe like one item with maximum life or so, you're gonna get something like roughly plus 20% total bonus HP. And that is pretty significant. Now, if you look at, for example, the Topazes, we have 10% damage reduction when you're crowd controlled, and they stack multiplicative with each other, so they don't add up 10 plus 10 plus 10, but it's like rather the damage taken is 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9. So the calculation goes like this. This is the remaining damage taken after you add 5 Topazes, which is 59%. So effectively you get 41% damage reduction. And now if you divide 1 by this value, we get our effective hit points. So while crowd controls, instead of having like 1 hit point or like 100% hit points, I would have 169.5% when I have Topazes in my gear. So instead of this 21.6% bonus from the rubies, I have roughly triple that as a benefit from having the Topazes. But on the other hand, this only works while you're actually crowd controlled. And as I mentioned, crowd controls are not really much of a thing anymore. Like in some cases, I don't even remember like when was the last time I was really crowd controlled and in danger by something. Maybe I walked over some mine and there was no monster nearby or so. So I don't really take any damage anyway. And yeah, here and there are some monsters that can stun you, but it just doesn't really seem as much of a problem anymore as it was previously. And for example, if we take this number now, which is our effective HP with Topazes, and then divide it by the 21.6% bonus that we had previously, there's actually only a difference of around 39% more toughness or more like effective hit points when you are crowd controlled with Topazes versus with rubies. So it's actually not such a large gap when you think about it. Now there are 2 things to consider here though, which is number 1, damage reduction of the same value is usually better than a higher life pool of the same value, simply because you also have to heal up a larger life pool, which may be slower. So if you look at, for example, this here, the stolen vigor aspect, that gives you a flat healing per second. Of course, if you have more life, it will take longer to heal up all that life and your overall recovery goes down. The thing is though that a lot of the universal and quite popular healing effects are actually not flat values, but percentage based. So number 1 is of course your healing potion. Yeah, you get a small flat healing, but then you get 35% of your life, and that will just change with your life pool. So if you have a higher life pool, you'll get more healing. And the same applies for passives, for example, the siphoning strikes. If you use that one, you get 3% of your maximum life. And that also changes with more life. And a similar thing goes for example, Raid Leader or Invigorating Fury on the Barb, or something like the heal on crit, or like the heal on elemental damage passives that the druids have. And a lot of classes actually have access to these percentage-based healing effects, where having a large life pool doesn't actually produce a downside in recovery. And overall, that leads me to think that rubies are probably just like the way, basically, for most builds at least, unless you have a really good reason to use something of the others. And I'm also gonna go with an example for the sapphires. So previously I was playing Barb with the Kratos Barb, you might have seen that one. And I was running Sapphires because as a barb, you are generally expected to be fortified at all times, and you get this 3% damage reduction. Now, one thing to know here is these damage reduction effects from the Sapphires, just like basically any other damage reduction in the game, is multiplicative. So basically what it does is, similar to the Topazes, it multiplies our damage taken by 0.97. And then we do that 5 times, for example, with 5 Sapphires. And then this leads us to a total damage reduction of 14.1 or 14.2% or so. And now again, if we divide 1 by this value, we're gonna get our increase in effective hit points while having fortified with the 5 Sapphires. So this means we divide this by 8,587, and this leads to a roughly 16.5% increase in toughness or EHP, versus the rubies previously with the 21.6%. So if you take that value here and then divide it by what we just got, which is roughly this, you get still a difference in around 4.4% increase in effective hit points if you run rubies instead of sapphires on a barbarian, even under the condition that you are always fortified. And first of all, you have to meet that condition of being fortified, and then it's still worse than a ruby, interestingly. So similar to the rogue where I removed all the topazes from my gear, I actually also started adding rubies instead of sapphires on my Kratos bar build now. And I actually went through, and on my Maxwell guides, for example, here we have these rubies everywhere now, because I think that just have become a better option. And thinking about it again, basically I realized like even something like sapphires is not really the way, because again, barbs usually have these percentage based healing effects, and yeah, fortified effects might be kind of difficult to stack up. There may still be a reason to run sapphires, for example, if you have permanently full fortify all the time, and again, if you actually care about recovery and healing a little bit more, then it might be worth it. But for the most part, I think that even on barbs, it's probably just better go rubies after all, unless you have a lot of these flat life bonuses. So again, you have to consider that the numbers I just calculated was based only on the base life, and you know, if you have something like a helm with life, if you have a chest with life, and you have a ring with life, then the benefit of rubies will be comparatively a bit weaker, and then those numbers will move a bit closer together between rubies and sapphires, or between rubies and topazes, for example. So the bottom line for me is that at least in the end game, once you are fully decked out, I think that flat life bonuses are not really that powerful anymore. I still would keep it at least on a helm. I guess for almost every build, getting like a life roll on a helm is basically like a free stat, because there's not really that many crazy things to roll here. You want cooldown, armor, life, and then usually one other thing. So this is kind of like a perfect helm here, for example, at least for like most of my builds. And yeah, not really... But in the case of chest and pants, there's always the option to go with more damage reduction stats, like a pants like this here, for example, armor damage reduction, and then distant and close damage reduction. So something like this is insanely powerful for survivability. And then similar here, like a chest piece, this maximum life could be replaced also with another damage reduction stat, with an armor stat, and would actually help me more than this 500 flat life here in basically any scenario. And even on the rings, you have pretty powerful stats. So there's usually crit, and then vulnerable. And then there's like one extra stat you can like put there. For example, here I actually have the life roll, but yeah, it's kind of like optional. And some builds, especially on sorcerers, for example, they want like resource generation there, or you want even something like lucky hit or maximum resource for some builds that actually scale with this stat as well. Or you can just have like another damage stat there, and I think that would be probably better in most cases, at least in late game. Earlier on though, there is a bit of a difference. So if you're like leveling, let's say, you know, 20, 40, 60, flat life bonuses actually have a much bigger impact, because your base life is significantly lower on the lower levels, and you can find relatively high power items relatively early. This means that if you're like fresh in Torment, for example, and you just found this one ring with plus 800 life, that 800 life might actually be like a total bonus of like plus 15% HP or something on its own, or even more, like 20%. So in that case, flat life bonuses on lower levels are much more impactful, because number one, you don't have that much base life, and number two, you also don't have that many life bonuses. You might not have like the full ruby setup, and you don't have the paragon setup that gives you even more maximum life percent. But the more you progress, the closer you get to level 100 and having optimal gear, the more and more this flat life on your items becomes less valuable and the percent life becomes more valuable. And that's it for what I have to share here. I hope you enjoyed this video and hope it helps you with your own builds and your own season. I'm going to be covering more builds, more stuff to come, so stay tuned. Hope you like this one, and see you guys next time.